Welcome you all. This is the Rotary Disability Advisory Group. Actually, this group started up in February last year, so this is our 1-year anniversary of this group. Yeah. So, and started out with 4 of us, quickly within a month and a half grew to 100 people, and now we're closing in on 500 people. So, we have a good group that we're reaching out to. And this course meeting will be recorded so that anybody doesn't have an opportunity to come to the meeting, they can certainly have an opportunity to see it. Once again, just a clarification, just a definition of what's different between this group and the club is this group focuses on helping Rotary become more welcoming to people with disabilities, and they do it in various ways. One is awareness, one is through encouraging accessibility, and another is through encouraging inclusion. And whereas the club works on human rights issues for around the world. So this group's main focus is Rotary, and the club's focus is basically the world. And I'm going to turn this over to Mark Wafer. Mark actually came in the early stages along with Jeremy almost at the same time. And it's the pleasure to work with him. The funny thing is that when we first started up the group, we were talking about the DEI committee in Rotary, and we said, do you have anybody with disabilities on your DEI committee? And they said, well, one of our members has a husband who's deaf, and that was the connection at that point. And so immediately I wrote to Mark, and he's been instrumental in who we are. Grace just joined us from Kenya. Welcome, Grace. So Mark, I'm going to turn this over to you. You can tell them a little bit more about yourself, because some of the people, and many of the people have not had the opportunity or the pleasure we had to meet you. And if I can ask everybody to mute their microphones until we get to a question and answer period afterwards, that would be helpful. I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Ken. And I'm absolutely delighted to be with all of you today. I really miss our regular meetings, and for those of you who went with us at the very beginning, we were having meetings nearly every day. It was great. I mean, we really enjoyed each other's company, and there was so much innovation and so much good stuff that was coming forward. So, so my schedule now doesn't allow me to jump on these meetings as often, but when I can, I will. You should know, if you don't already, that the addition of Jeremey Opperman on the Global DEI Task Force has been remarkable. And so thank you, Jeremy, for your contribution on the task force. They are delighted to have you there. So a little bit about myself. I was a restaurant owner for 25 years. In fact, Valerie and I own 14 restaurants in the city of Toronto over 25 years. And in that time, we employed almost 250 workers who had disabilities. And so that was all kinds of disabilities, every type of disability, to be honest. And in every position in the company. So everything from entry level right up to senior management. In fact, the top person in my company, my director of operations, she has a significant learning disability, and she is now the owner of 4 of those restaurants. We sold the business in 2017 after a 25-year journey. And today I'm an activist. I'm an activist for people with disabilities, particularly in the area of employment. So I was born deaf. I have about 15% residual hearing. I wear Bluetooth hearing aids, which help to a certain degree, but my main method of communication is by lip reading. So you can imagine the last 2 years have been hell, everybody wearing a mask. Very hard to lip read through a mask. So Somebody said to me a little while ago, "What's the solution, Mark?" And I said, "Bail money," because I was getting pretty angry over this whole thing. But yeah, we don't have a pandemic. I can communicate quite well without being able to hear, simply by lip reading. I'm the chair of the board of directors for the Canadian Hearing Services, which is a national organization, $50 million budget, which is the go-to for everything hearing in Canada. And I'm also the chair of the board of directors for what's known as Disabilities Canada. And Disabilities Canada is actually a 125,000 square foot sporting complex, but the most important piece of it is the programs that we have for the disabled, especially those who have autism. We have partnerships in 35 countries, and so we have a global footprint. And so as an activist, I am very busy. But how did this get started? If you go back to the early 90s, when Valerie and I decided to open our first restaurant, this was a franchise restaurant. We opened a restaurant that was already in operation for 2 years. So we took it over from another owner. And that owner was opening a different type of restaurant. So he took all his staff with him. So here we are, a restaurant been open for 2 years, a very large clientele, very busy, and I have all new staff. And so we failed miserably that day, on opening day. The staff was slow, the productivity was poor, and the restaurant looked awful by the end of the day. Dishes were piled up and so on. So I had a need to hire somebody to look after the dining room. And this is the early 90s, so this is before the internet. So we put an ad on the door, the dining room attendant needed. And the person who came in and applied for the job was a young man by the name of Clint Sperling. And Clint has Down syndrome. At that point in my life, I hadn't been around people with intellectual disabilities, so I really didn't know what to expect. But what I did know is that because of the barriers that I had faced as a disabled person, I knew that if Clint just kept walking down the street, knocking on doors, he was not going to find a job. Nobody was going to hire him, because this is almost 30 years ago. So I decided to give him a chance. And I enlisted the help of a local agency who had job coaches and job specialists for people with intellectual disabilities to help train Clint. When it comes to the spectrum of Down syndrome, he's below the 50th percentile, so he's actually quite challenged. He didn't know how to take a bus. All the buses looked the same, so he didn't know which one was his. So we had to teach him how to do that. So the training took a little while, but then he came on board. And after a couple of months on the job, I realized that Clint had become my best employee. He would come to work an hour early. Nobody else did that. I couldn't get him to take a break. Everybody else wanted a break as often as they could. And I definitely couldn't get him to go home at the end of the day. And so there's a loyalty in this individual that I didn't find in any other employee. And so even when it came to uniform, for example, my staff all wore a uniform. I would not permit them. I had a policy not to wear your uniform to work. You put your uniform on when you get to work. Because otherwise you're getting on the subway, you're getting buses, you contaminate the uniform and you're working with food. That's not a good combination. Clint wanted to wear his uniform to work. So I had to make an exception for him because he wanted everybody on that bus to know that he worked at my restaurant, the Tim Hortons brand. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew he worked at Tim Hortons. He had that kind of pride in his job. No other employee had that. So as we grew the business, and we grew fast, we had 5 restaurants within 5 years. We continued to add people with intellectual disabilities, with Down syndrome, with autism, with other types of cognitive disabilities. And we noticed a trend. We started to see a pattern. These workers did not require any supervision. Once you showed them how to do the job, that's how they do the job. These individuals were not looking at the clock to see when was the next smoke break. These individuals never called in sick. The job was precious to them. And so we started to see that there was definitely a business case here for being an inclusive employer. We were also getting phone calls from potential customers asking us if we were the restaurant that had hired people with disabilities. And when we said we were, they said, oh, okay, great, we're coming to your place for lunch today. So there was definitely, without question, there was a business case. And so around 1995, my wife and I decided that we were going to open our doors to anyone with a disability, any type of disability, on the condition that they could do the job or they could be trained to do the job. And by the time we sold our business in 2017, we had employed over 250 workers with disabilities. And this is people in wheelchairs, people missing limbs, deaf, blind, significant mental health, schizophrenia, for example, episodic disabilities such as MS, people with cerebral palsy, all types of disabilities. And the important thing is that these jobs were competitively paid. That was the important thing. It's one thing for somebody to be able to make a contribution, but it's also important for them to go home with a paycheck just like everybody else. That's how you live a full life. This was noticed by the media. And so we spent many years in the media. I was actually on our national broadcast last night at 6 o'clock because the topic is still there. And Clint actually became a media darling. It's actually very, very funny because Clint's he's a ham. He's a humorous man, he's a comedian. And so he just loves being on TV and being in the newspaper. And eventually there was a 1-hour documentary made on his life. So here we are 25 plus years later, and I'm out of the business, and Clint is still working in the restaurant. He's 50 years old now. For someone with Down syndrome, that's about 75 years old. So he's a lot slower now. He needs to take more breaks. He needs to take a nap during his shift, and that's okay. That's okay, right? Small accommodation to make sure he's still able to contribute. And he just loves going to work every day, seeing the customers and being a social butterfly that he is. But he gets the job done, and that's the important thing to the business. So around 2000, 2001, 2002, because of the media attention that we had received, I started speaking about it. And eventually it became almost a full-time job. I've traveled around the world. I've spoken as far south as Australia. I've spoken as far north as above the Arctic Circle and everywhere in between. Always talking about the need for employment, but looking at it from an employer's perspective. What's in it for the employer? Because that's how you open doors. It's making sure the employers know that there's benefits to being inclusive, that there's benefits to your bottom line. Once you talk to employers with that kind of message, employers start to take notice. As you know, Valerie's been in Rotary for a long time. I haven't. I joined Rotary in 2008, and I actually joined for a reason. I had been approached and asked if I joined Rotary, would I start a program to educate Rotarians who might be in business or who are in a position to influence hiring in their companies, to talk to them about the business case and see if we could get people with disabilities into the employment with Rotarians. And so we did. In 2008, we started a program called Rotary at Work. And it started in District 7070, just outside Toronto. And we did our first presentation to a club that meets at 7 o'clock in the morning, downtown Toronto. And there didn't seem to be very much interest at all. They just politely listened to our presentation. And at the end, when we had a Q&A, one guy puts his hand up and he says, I'd like to hire somebody with a disability. How do I do it? And I thought, well, we're onto something here. And so we decided in our second presentation to bring the service sector along with us. So we would, wherever we were doing a presentation, we would call the local service sector agencies and say, we're doing a presentation here, which is the demand side. We'd like you to come so you can help with the supply side. If somebody in the room puts their hand up and says, we want to hire somebody with a disability, that way we've got somebody in the room who knows what to do. We, in a 5-year period, we visited 700 Rotary clubs across Canada, in New York State, Michigan, Florida, and in that time, 1,500 people with disabilities found work with Rotarians. Many of those people to this day are still employed. We're talking people who have been employed in the same jobs for over 10 years because Rotarians stepped up. I stepped away from the program about just 6 or 7 years ago because we had saturated Southern Ontario. But somebody picked up the program and took it out to BC and Alberta, where it is still going strong in District 504 and 5050. So now, as you can imagine, the partner of the Vice President, I have a significant role to play in Rotary, and I'm able to continue to work as an activist in Rotary and with a global footprint. The beginning of this was with the DEI task force, the one I was talking about with Jeremy on. So that's been around for 2 years, and I've been able to help in the background with that. I'm not only an expert on the business case for employment for people with disabilities, but I'm also very heavily involved in all aspects of DEI from an intersectionality point of view. The new president, Jennifer Jones, her overarching theme is about inclusion. And so DEI is very, very important to her. The nominee, Gord from Scotland, it's also important to him. So we have a number of presidents coming in now where DEI is extremely important, inclusion is extremely important. And so this conversation will continue to flourish. Today is the beginning of the training session for the new DGEs from around the world. So there's 535 district governor-elects who will start July 1st. And the final piece of their 3 years of training begins today, and it's online. Typically, it would be in Florida or San Diego, but it starts today. 3 weeks ago, a number of us went into the studio to record our presentation for IA, International Assembly, and I did a piece on disability and the importance of bringing people with disabilities into our Rotary clubs. Something that is not happening right now. And I actually mentioned the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy. So the name of the club is actually going to come up today in the recording. So these are plenary sessions. And as the DGEs do their training, there's plenary sessions that will come up online for each of the days, days ahead. And the training is going to take anywhere from a week to 10 days. By the end of the month, those plenary sessions are going to be made public as long as we have a login with Rotary. So all of you will have a chance to see those plenary sessions by the end of this month. When I did my presentation for IA, I focused on the importance of bringing people with disabilities into Rotary as Rotarians. One of the things that we are very good at is altruism. Rotarians have a big heart. We have deep pockets, but we also have long arms. We're not afraid to pull our wallet out and give. And altruism is great in terms of the programs that we have, the polio post syndrome post-polio syndrome, making sure that people have the aids that they require, making sure that children with disabilities have wheelchairs, have walking canes, have service animals. We're very good at that. And so quite often when I speak to a Rotary Club about something similar to what I'm saying today, somebody will come up to me at the end of the day, oh, thank you for talking about disability. We've been donating to such and such a cause. Happens every time. Yes, thank you very much for what you're doing, but that's not the message that I gave you today. The message I gave you today is the inclusion of people with disabilities in your Rotary clubs. So the fact that you donate to an agency or donate to a cause is great, but I want you to shift that focus to inclusion of people with disabilities in your Rotary club. If you look around us today, and like I said, I visited 700 Rotary clubs in 5 years. I never met a disabled person, ever, by visiting those Rotary clubs. I never saw a person in a wheelchair. I never saw a service animal. I never saw somebody with a white cane. I never saw a sign language interpreter for somebody who might be deaf. Never saw that. Because Rotary Club did not include people with disabilities. Because they bought into so many stereotypes, myths, and misperceptions. But the reality is, and this is the message that we keep trying to get across to Rotarians, is that every one of us is going to become, we're going to become disabled at some point. Every one of us, as we get older, we're going to have mobility issues. Now, right now, I live in Burlington, Ontario, so right on the shores of Lake Ontario. So for those of you who came to Toronto for the 2018 convention, that's basically where I live, just a little bit to the west. But before I moved here in August, I lived in a small town, like 2 hours north of here, and they have a Rotary Club. The Rotary Club of Thornbury, been around since 1935. And they meet in an old 150-year-old church. They meet in the basement of the church. The church has about 10 steps to get into it. When you get into the church, there's no elevator to get down into the basement. So you have to go down about 20 steps to get into the basement. And so they obviously have never brought anybody in, not just as a Rotarian or prospective member who had a mobility disability, but they never even brought in a speaker. So how did they get that person down into the basement? But here's the worst part. They have members who are leaving as they get older because they can't get into the building. And right across the street is a brand new, fully accessible, state-of-the-art library with meeting rooms. The Rotary Club of Thornbury will not give up the church. They will not move across the streets. Okay? And so these are the conversations that we have to have with Rotarians, with Rotary clubs. We need to get them to understand that 20% of your community are people with disabilities. This is a huge group, a huge demographic. It's 1 in 5 of the world population. By the year 2030, it's going to be 1 in 4. In fact, some jurisdictions, like where I live, we're already at 1 in 4, because we're at 23.9% people with disabilities. So we're already there. And with age-related disabilities, and now COVID-related disabilities, we're easily going to be at 1 in 4. And we need to reach out to these people. Why is it important to reach out to these people? Well, first of all, it's the right thing to do. And we're losing members, especially in North America. We're losing members every year, so we need to tap into untapped groups. But what happens, though, when you bring somebody in who has a disability? You create a more innovative Rotary club. Because a person with a disability does things differently to everybody else. They're not geniuses, they're not smarter than anybody else. But if you're in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy, you get up in the morning and take a shower and get dressed and make breakfast and You go down to the parking garage and get into your car and you drive to work, or you drive to school, or you drive to the Rotary Club. Sometimes with hand controls. That individual is doing something completely different to everybody else. Completely different. And that's how innovation is created. And so these people, these potential members, Rotary Club members, these potential members bring an innovative mindset into your Rotary Club, and they will show us how to do things differently. You actually become more competitive if you include people with disabilities. And it's not just one person, it's not one member, because that's just tokenism. It's when you start to build some capacity, when you've got a number of people with disabilities in your Rotary Club. One of the stories I like to share about it, bringing people with disabilities at the Rotary Clubs. In the hometown where our new Rotary president comes from, Windsor, Ontario, there's about 6 or 7 Rotary clubs in that city. In one of the clubs, a member sponsored a young man with Down syndrome to become a member of the club. This young man had heard all about Rotary because his uncle was a Rotarian and other family members were Rotarian. He was in his mid-20s and he wanted to become a Rotarian. So he found a club member who would sponsor him to go into this club. It caused a huge ruckus within the club. And the president of the club resigned over it because he did not want a disabled person joining his club. Good, I'm glad that that person left. So the young man became a Rotarian, and one of the first things that he got involved with was selling raffle tickets for a speedboat. So this is a $25,000, $30,000 speedboat. Windsor happens to be on the Great Lakes, so boats are important. And out of the 100 members in that Rotary Club, this young man sold the most tickets. He sold the most tickets. Right? And so he became the person in charge of raffle tickets from that point on. He brought something to that club that nobody else had, the gift to be able to sell raffle tickets to people. And so it's important that we recognize the contribution that people with disabilities can make in our Rotary clubs. And we need to invite them to be full members of our Rotary Club. We need to look at where we meet to make sure that it's accessible. And we need to give a voice to the 1 in 4 people in our community who currently are not being included. And one of the things, just to finish off here, when I speak to groups about this, that are not people like yourselves, like many of you here, I'm preaching to the converted. But when I'm speaking to a group, a business group, chambers of commerce, I did a presentation last week to a university in British Columbia. None of those people were disabled, but they heard my message for the first time. I leave them with a statistic that just blows their mind, and that's this one. In Canada, 23% of the population has a disability. It's the largest minority group. In fact, it's the largest minority group in the world. But there's people who will look at that and say to themselves, well, in my business, I don't see too many people with disabilities. I can afford to ignore that number. Well, they can't. Because around the world, if you take the 20% of people with a disability around the world, and you add in the immediate family members, so brother, sister, son, daughter, mom, dad, you are now at 74% of the world population. 74%. And when I give somebody that statistic, that's when they just sit straight up in their chair and they think, wow, I really can't afford to ignore the disability community. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for having me here. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Nothing too complicated, please.
Thank you, Mark. Anybody has any questions, please ask them to Mark.
Mark, this is John Annie. I didn't catch the group of that 74% that you added.
The 74%?
Yes.
So
when you add from the 20%, what were the groups above that?
So you've got the statistics come from what we call StatsCan. So this is the official Canadian statistics. In the United States, I think you call it there's another name for it, but it's the official statistic. We just changed our statistic. So we just had a census in the last couple of years. And so the statistics just changed. So they're very fresh. So 23.5% of Canadians have a disability. If you add in a family member, right, you add 74% of Canadians either have a disability or directly affected by disability. So if you look at my business, for example, when we sold our business in 2017, we had an average of 14,000 customers a day. So you can imagine the impact that had on my business when somewhere around 9,000 of those customers every day were coming into my restaurant, seeing workers with disabilities, and they themselves are affected. They either have a disability themselves or they have a loved one at home who has a disability. And so that number is so much more important than just talking about the number of people who have disabilities, because it shows just how many people in the world are deeply affected.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ken, can I add to that? Can I add on to what Mark has said?
Of course.
All right. So, and I think it's a really important, I mean, these stats are important to grasp. And the other side of that, when Mark talks about the 23% of Canadians, is that, and you must remember that the world is not made up of first world countries. The world is actually made up of developing countries with a handful of first world developed countries. And there's a direct correlation between the numbers of persons with disabilities in a country and whether they are developing or developed. And so your developing countries will always have more, from a percentage point of view, persons with disabilities, simply because developing countries create more disability reasons, such as motor vehicle accidents, crime, war, and poverty. And so numbers are very scary if you drill down and you really start interrogating them.
It's so true, Jeremy. And a few years ago, when I would do presentations, I would often say, "Can you please put your hand up if you have a loved one at home who has a disability?" And always, at least 50% of the room put their hand up. 50%. So you know there's people in the room who are too nervous or shy to put their hand up, so you know the number is going to be higher. That was always more than half the people in the room. The other thing too, on top of that, Jeremy, is the fact that some developing nations do not have the ability to collate numbers.
Yeah.
So when you go into countries like Vietnam, for example, if you go to Vietnam 20, 25 years ago, the number of people who were disabled was astronomical because of the wars that they had gone through. Same with Cambodia, just absolutely astronomical numbers, but they weren't counted. The country did not have the ability to do a correct census. So,
Well,
go ahead, Jeremy.
Sorry, Mark, you're right. But the other thing is that there are cultural issues around, particularly countries like Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, where there's quite a strong cultural bias against disability. And so it might be that they didn't have the ability to count them, but it's also that they didn't want to count them. Or they don't want to be counted. To find a job in Cambodia with a disability is next to impossible. because there's an extraordinary cultural bias working against them.
Yes, very much so. I love having these conversations with Jeremy.
We mustn't take over. Let the others have a chance.
Mike, I have a question, if nobody else does. When we first formed this group, we had a lot of discussion on sign language interpreters in Rotary. And that's been a little bit lost at this point, as far as we wanted to try to encourage Rotary International, Rotary districts to have sign language interpreters. Has there been any progress in that, Mark, as far as you know? Has Rotary changed any as far as getting more sign language interpreters, particularly at the RI level?
Yeah, there has to. Where we're seeing progress is with the live captain. So the presentations that are being done, starting today with International Assembly, everything is closed captioned. This is the first year that that's the case. Last year, there was a lack of closed captioning because of the haste in putting everything together. The year before, with 2020, January 2020, IA was it was live. It was in person in San Diego, and I had captioning for plenary sessions. But off plenary sessions, there was no captioning. And you know, when you think about it, I'm not a part-time deaf person. So I'm not deaf only in a plenary session. I'm deaf all the time. So if I go from a plenary session to a breakout session to a training session, and there's no captioning there, I'm deaf and I can't communicate it. So this year, Jennifer made sure that everything is captioned. The argument that I've had for sign language is that there's an expense, there's a cost with sign language. And some places in the world there isn't, but certainly in developed world, in developed nations, there's a significant cost to a captioner. So in Canada, for example, captioning is $165 per hour with a 3-hour minimum. So you can imagine that would be a burden on a Rotary club. But there's a better way to fix that, and that is to invite interpreters to become Rotarians. You know, and that way you get your captioning for free. But you have to be innovative and think about how can we solve this problem. You know, I look at Canadian Hearing Services, where I already said I'm on the board of directors. We have almost 100 ASL and LSQ interpreters, and why don't we invite those people to Rotary? So there's solutions, Ken, but it's not on the radar with RI at the moment. Okay. Sometimes it's baby steps. It can be frustrating, but you know, think about the difference that we've made, and you can, especially you can, the difference that you've made in Rotary in the last 12 months is absolutely phenomenal. So we got to keep pushing, keep going.
All right, so it's good to hear. I know, and I don't want to other people have questions, but the club that was from Albany, New York, who's made up of mostly people who are deaf, their thing was not only to have interpreters at the meetings, but also to have the interpreters available after the meetings, so that when they wanted to have a social conversation with somebody, that interpreter would have access to somebody. So Rotary may want to think about that when we go back to live meetings.
Yeah. So that Rotary Club is actually in Rochester, New York. And
okay.
Yeah. And the reason that it existed because the universities for the deaf, one of the big universities for the deaf is in Rochester. So people who are deaf tend to live, especially if you're completely deaf, there's what we call deaf culture. So people live or marry within the deaf community, and then they tend to live close to where they went to university. So there's a huge number of deaf people in Rochester. Same with Washington, D.C., with Rotary University. The issue is not just with captioners, with interpreters at the club level. That club belongs to a district. That district has a conference. That district has leadership roles. Those leaders come from the various clubs. That district has never reached out to that deaf club because they don't know how. They don't know what to do. And they will not provide the interpreters for a district conference. And so, Ken, there's so much work that needs to be done. You know, you can't just have that club and tick a box and say, yeah, we've done everything we can. We've got a deaf club. Wow, that's great. Well, yeah, it is great, but there's a lot more we can do. Yeah. I saw somebody else's hand up there. Jacqueline, did you have a question?
Jacqueline, you're on mute. Jacqueline's from Egypt.
From Egypt, yeah. I am a doctor in Egypt. Thank you, Mark, for your interesting talk. This is the first time to hear about this scary percentage of disabled persons. And as Jeremy told before, I agree that the number will be higher and higher in the developing countries like Egypt. But I think that we cannot discover the people with learning disabilities or something like this. So undiagnosed cases are the cause or the main cause of incorrect number or incorrect percentage of disabled persons in developing countries. My question is about our role as Rotarians to help people with disability to find jobs. I think that one of the most important projects is to convince people here to train disabled persons and to hire or give them more opportunities to be hired in their companies like you. I congratulate you for your initiative and your kindness. And I think that you open the door and give us more thoughts to imitate you and try to give disabled persons in developing countries more opportunity for employment. Thank you. Thank you for this interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. The important thing is when it comes to employment, the important thing is to understand that this has to have validation and value to the employer. I hired close to 250 people. I didn't do that because I got big heart. No, I did it because it was good for my business. I knew that being an inclusive employer was going to improve my bottom line. It was going to improve the number of sales that I had, the transactions that I had, because people were telling me that. Customers were telling me that. I come to your restaurant, Mark, because you hire people with disability. And so there was a clear business case for that. Of course, it's the right thing to do. And as a person with a disability, I was in alignment with a lot of these workers in terms of the barriers they had faced throughout their life. But when you're in business for one reason. That is to make money. Anybody who tells you they're in business for any other reason, they're lying. You're in business to make money. We were no different. That's not greed, but it's the only way in which a business can survive is if it's making money. Otherwise, it will die. You will go bankrupt. The last year I was in business, my payroll was $3 million. That kept me awake at night. Because I had to make sure I had the sales and the transactions and increased sales over last year because costs keep going up. To be able to make sure I could pay my 250, my 300 employees who were working for me at that time, working with us at that time. All right, so it's not necessarily great. So that's why the message is even more important. When we talk to employers and say, I want you to hire somebody with a disability. And if you go back 25, 30 years, this is the message. I want you to hire somebody with a disability. I have this fine gentleman here. He's going to do a great job for you. Would you please hire him?
Yeah.
That doesn't work. But
Yeah.
if I go to an employer and I say, would you like to make more money today? Would you like to have a healthy bottom line today? They're always going to say, tell me more. Explain to me what you mean. And I talk about inclusion. So you're talking to employees from a completely different perspective. Is what's in it for them. But at the end of the day, you're opening doors so that people with disabilities do find work. And so the success rate with that approach is so much higher than any of the other approaches that we used over the last 2 decades. And it's scalable. So for me, even with 14 restaurants, I'm considered a small business owner, but I could go to the General Motors, North America, and have the same conversation because we all speak the same language. So it's scalable. Thank you for your comment, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your reply. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, I'm still stuck on that 74%. I mean, that's an amazing figure. And, then add the other aspects of DEI, LGBTQ plus and all of that. Okay, that number's got to be near 100%.
What you're getting into here now, the intersectionality of it all. Once you get to the intersectionality, it's everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's
everybody.
amazing.
Yeah. So when I do DEI presentations, not necessarily just disability presentations, when I do DEI, I talk about what we call SWAMs. I do this at the beginning of my presentation, the SWAM. A SWAM is a straight, white, able-bodied male. A straight, white, able-bodied male. And you don't want to embarrass anybody, but you look around the room and see how many SWAMs are there. There's very, very few. There's very few. Because not everybody is straight. Not everybody is white. Not everybody is able-bodied. And not everybody is male. So once you get into the intersectionality, John, it's almost everybody. The thing is that straight, white, able-bodied men actually believe that they are the majority. That is a ingrained belief of straight, white, able-bodied men that they are the majority in society. They're not at all, not even close. Right? So good point, John. Intersectionality, you bring that in and it affects everybody.
Thank you, John. Anybody else has any questions? We're getting kind of close to the end of the hour here, but one thing, it's an amazing room, Mark, people from all over the world here. I did want to recognize Maritine. You said you were from Switzerland, is that true? Obviously it's true, it's a stupid question.
Yes, I'm French living in Switzerland. I was only aware at 2 o'clock this afternoon about this meeting and I had clients in my office, so I'm sorry for being late. I was interested because I'm very involved in exchanging young people from Switzerland, and we sometimes welcome people who have kind of disability, and that's why I was curious to hear what you were saying, and I apologize for being late.
Maritine, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I'd love to connect with you. Can you put your email in the chat? I'd love
yes,
to
certainly.
get you involved in what we're doing, and we don't have anybody from Switzerland at this point. So
yes, thank you very much. That will be the email with my company, which is this one.
And meanwhile, one of the things is, Mark, that's kind of interesting as to what has happened with this group is that, obviously part of Rotary is networking. And as this group starts talking about different things, particularly the Rotarian parts of it, but everybody, they said, well, maybe we should make Rotary aware of this or another area, like, for example, medical care for people with disabilities. That's something that obviously is a huge issue, and can get carried away on it. But there's a group that says, let's take a look at it and see if there's something we can do to try to make Rotary more aware of it. And one of the things, John, out of that came a discussion about how is Rotary dealing with people with polio. They're working on eradication, but have they done anything with people with polio? So, I mean, it's just amazing, Mark, how all these side groups are now coming out of this thing and continuing the conversation on trying to work with Rotary and trying to make awareness of people with Rotary on different issues with disabilities. So it's a fascinating journey. And I'm glad I'm on it. I'm glad everybody here is on it.
Would you allow me to add something which was interesting? You spoke about Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on. In Switzerland, we started in 1995 a project with Cambodia. They have a lot of mine victims, and we thought first we would send money, but we realized very fast that was not the answer. And what we did is we went over there and we helped them to build some workshop where they could learn how to make the prothèse, how to build them themselves, because we found out that one child needs 1 to 3 prothèses per year because of the how can I say, the growth, and one adult needs a prothèse per year. So not only did we help them, but they came back to a certain dignity and certain value, and not being discriminated and not being separated from the rest of the world. And that was very important for us. So what we have to do is to include these people, but also letting them have their value. That's all what I wanted to say. This project is still on, and it's called MineX. And every year, in all the clubs of Switzerland, we make actions to raise money to build more workshops for them and more employment. Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you. And Rotary, for the work that you're doing there. Rotary is an amazing organization, and that's why it's good to have this disability awareness and as part of Rotary at this point. It's just the power of Rotary and the power of a huge networking group around the world that makes it really amazing. Marianne here, she's from Tennessee, Nashville. And glad to have her on board here. So thank you all. This event has been recorded, and we'll share it all with you and everybody else who didn't have a chance to come here. The club meeting for Rotary World, the Rotary Club of World Disability Advocacy is on February 21st. We'll send out notifications on that, and the next meeting of this group will be on March 7th, as each group meets once a month, basically.
Ken,
All right.
good evening, Ken. I have a point to talk to you. May I say something?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Doctor.
I'm Dr. Farhana, Rotarian Dr. Farhana from Bangladesh. There is the 117th birthday of Rotary is on 23rd of February. So I was from Bangladesh. Our district governor has taken up a very exemplary decision, and 300 clubs from Bangladesh are participating on it. and there's a major part on disability, concerning disability. So since it's 117 years of Rotary, so from World Disability Day, can we all do, we are also doing we are doing disability work from, I'm doing from my club. So if we all compile something that we send it to Ken, that what I am doing, this is my work, so I'm a member of this club. So wherever I do it in Bangladesh or in Canada or wherever, so if I just send it to you and we can compile that, this is the work being done for 117th, commemorating 117th birthday of Rotary. So what do you think of it? We can support, you can all support me to do more work because it's a developing third world country. So we can do it, or we can send you things that everyone is doing on this occasion.
Doctor, send it to me and also post it in the friends group, and we'll post it in the club, and we'll share it out with our mailing list. And those who, I think it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic. So we can get the word out about it. I was glad to try to do that through this group. And those who want to share it with you, they certainly will step forward. Rotarians will do that kind of stuff. So I appreciate what you're doing. So please send it to me.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you. We have a good day, evening, night, and we'll see you again in another month. But we'll talk between then. Thank you.